Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for coming to our final CEN seminar of this Christmas term. We are very Christmassy here with mince pies and such in person. So today we are very, very happy to welcome Roisin Perry, Dr. Roisin Perry, one of our very own here at the CEN. So Roisin recently completed a PhD at the UCL Institute of Education. Her PhD project focused on social inequalities in cognitive development and educational attainment during adolescence. And she is now a lecturer and a developmental psychologist interested in risk and protective factors for school and mental health related outcomes, particularly in neurodivergent children and young people, and how we might reduce some of these inequalities and outcomes. And today, she's going to be telling us about her study, which found 24-month Effortful control predicts emerging autism characteristics. So I will hand over to Roisin and we'll hear all about it.
Thank you, Astrid. Can everyone hear me okay online?
Yes.
Perfect. Amazing. Okay, yes. So today I'm going to be sharing with you the results from a recent paper I published with my co-authors listed here. Goes by the same title of this talk. I'll actually share the link to the paper in this chat with you now. So it's available open access, so accessible to anyone. So let's get started. The background. Oh, it's not progressing.
Oh no.
Going so well.
Oh no, tech.
Ah, we go. Oh, there we go. Background. So to understand this study, I first need to explain infant sibling designs. So these are a really clever kind of methodology in neurodevelopmental condition research, where we follow a group of children from birth, and we select those children because we know that they have elevated likelihood for a particular neurodevelopmental condition. So this talk is focusing on autism. So what you would do is you would identify some families who have already got an autistic child, and then you would follow the development of their younger child who is more likely themselves to be autistic. And we know this because autism does run in families to some extent. And this kind of research has told us a lot about the early development of autism. And a particularly important conclusion from this line of work is that autism is likely a result of divergent development in multiple different cognitive domains. So this is kind of allowing us to properly reject those old 1980s views that autism is just like a deficit in social communication. Actually, it appears that there's differences in the early development of multiple different cognitive systems that explain the eventual characteristics that we describe as autism. So despite all this progress, we still don't know very much about how different cognitive skills in infancy are related to one another. So how they're influencing each other over development. And we also know very little about the relationship between early cognitive skills and later autism characteristics. So we don't know much about any possible early predictors, essentially, that might help us to identify children who are at risk for some kind of difficulties later in life. And this study is one step towards filling this gap. So some of you might be thinking this is Centre for Educational Neuroscience, why am I talking about infants? Well, I do think that this kind of research is also relevant for educators of older children, and hopefully you all agree since you've come along today. So some kind of things that you can draw from this line of research. It can help us to understand why some children come to school not meeting their early years foundation stage profile targets. So understanding what's gone on before in development is really important for understanding the children that you eventually are presented with when they start formal schooling. Also, a really important message here is that neurodevelopmental conditions are not just the result of one area of difference or difficulty. Development is complex and it doesn't happen in isolation. So yeah, understanding those kind of early developmental relationships between different cognitive systems is key to understanding the profiles of children with different neurodevelopmental conditions. And finally, this kind of research can help to inform early screening programs for maybe for a specific diagnosis, maybe just for possible difficulties in general. And early screening might help to reduce the negative consequences of late, oh, sorry, there's a typo there, of late identification of needs. So we know that when individuals aren't identified as having neurodevelopmental conditions or difficulties in a certain area until adolescence or adulthood, these people tend to have much higher rates of mental health difficulties, and they tend to struggle more in school. So potentially this work in very early infancy might help to inform programs that might avoid some of those negative consequences. Okay, and this particular study, we used an infant sibling design, and we studied the relationship between different early cognitive skills over the first 3 years of life. We also looked at the relationship of those early cognitive skills to the emergence of autism characteristics. So this is autism characteristics measured at age 3. And in this particular study, we focused on effortful control and sensory motor skills. And I'll explain to you in the next couple of slides what those are. So effortful control, we kind of think of this as early executive function skills. So it's the deliberate regulation of emotions and behavior by infants. And in infancy, you can measure this by asking parents, typically, about how their child behaves. So you might look at things like how long after becoming distressed is the child soothed when you pick them up? Or when they're slightly older, how often can they spend an extended period of time interacting with one object? So we know that these effortful control skills show rapid development during infancy. And we also know that in infants with elevated familial likelihood for autism, so those infants who have an autistic older sibling, we do see difficulties with effortful control skills from early in life. Research has also shown that there's cross-sectional links between effortful control skills and autism characteristics, as well as effortful control skills and sensory motor skills. But there's problems when we look at cross-sectional studies with understanding which direction those associations go in. So maybe sensory motor skills influence effortful control skills, maybe effortful control skills influence sensory motor skills. We can't really draw those conclusions from this type of work. And also with cross-sectional research, so when we're measuring skills at one point in time, there's always the possibility that there's some confounding going on. So there's some kind of unmeasured factor that is explaining the relationship between those things. So longitudinal designs where we measure these skills at multiple time points and then get a sense of how these skills develop together allow us to get around these issues to some extent. And then why also focus on sensory motor skills? Well, it's very well established that kind of across neurodevelopmental conditions, there are some sensory motor differences. And actually now it's one of the diagnostic criteria for autism is the sensory either hypersensitivity or reduced sensitivity. And again, the infant sibling research has shown that there are differences between typically developing infants, so those with no first degree relatives with autism, and those who go on to be diagnosed with autism or who have elevated likelihood. So, but again, this research is predominantly cross-sectional. So what kind of theoretical perspectives can we use to understand these findings and to kind of take forward the research area? Well, developmental cascades is one really useful theoretical framework for thinking about the early development of cognitive skills. And what this theory suggests is that earlier developing cognitive skills are foundational for the development of more complex later developing skills. So the idea here, for example, is that you need some level of kind of sensory motor skills, for example, to be able to interact with your environment, to learn some things about causality, perhaps. And this will in turn influence those later developing more complex cognitive skills like effortful control. But then once those effortful control skills are developing, this theory suggests that there is reciprocal influence between different cognitive skills. So difficulties in one area essentially can feed back to difficulties in other areas and kind of result in these like cumulative effects, which go on to look like a specific profile of a neurodevelopmental condition. So what this theory suggests is that autism is the result of atypical development of lower level skills, so those earlier developing skills, constraining the development of higher level skills. And then there's this kind of ongoing backwards and forwards relationship and influence between these things, ending up in some kind of cumulative effect, which looks like quite a different developmental outcome to a typical one. And then another theory here, which is kind of useful, especially in understanding neurodevelopmental conditions, is anterior modifiers in the emergence of neurodevelopmental disorders, or let's just call it AMEND for simplicity. So what this suggests is that cognitive systems that are subserved by regions in the front of the brain or anterior part of the brain can shape a child's developmental trajectory. So these so-called anterior modifiers are thought to influence the relationship between atypical early development of lower level skills and later autism characteristics. So let's use the example of the cognitive skills I'm looking at. If you were shown some early sensory motor difficulties, the idea here is that a skill like effortful control might be able to kind of push you down a different developmental trajectory. And you may end up with lower levels of autism characteristics compared to an infant who had sensory motor difficulties and effortful control difficulties. So the authors suggest that this is relevant even in typical development. We do see, not typical variation in populations, even in people who don't reach like clinical levels for a neurodevelopmental condition, but they expect the effects of these anterior modifiers to be stronger in infants with genetic liability for neurodivergence because they are more likely to have these lower level cognitive difficulties. So to meet the criteria for an anterior modifier, the cognitive skill needs to become increasingly related to autism characteristics over development. So for example, if I measured effortful control at 4 months and at 24 months, we need to see that the relation, and we measure autism characteristics at 36 months, say, we would expect to see that the relationship between 24 months effortful control, 36-month autism characteristics is stronger than the relationship between 4-month effortful control and 36-month autism characteristics. The second criteria is that they are negatively related to neurodivergent outcomes. So, for example, higher levels of effortful control skills, lower levels of autism characteristics. And the third criteria is evidence that this skill moderates the relationship between lower level cognitive skills and neurodivergent outcomes. And this is the part that is really hard to study. And, we're not exactly getting at that in this research. This is an observational study. But what I'm going to show you is evidence about statistical interactions, which can suggest to us this kind of relationship that is going on over development. Okay, and the final point that we looked at in this study is socioeconomic status. So it's very rarely looked at in the context of neurodiversity, but since this is a study about individual differences, I felt it was important to kind of account for other family factors that might be going on. So what we know about socioeconomic status, it's a source of individual differences in typically developing populations. We know it predicts these cognitive skills we're interested in, sensory motor skills, effortful control skills, amongst others. And in combination with your level of, your liability for a neurodevelopmental condition, it may affect your support needs. So the support needs of a child from a low socioeconomic status family who has genetic liability for autism may be higher than the support needs of a child from a more affluent family, for example. And another problem when we don't look at this in research is that it's a possible confound. So anecdotally, especially the control groups in studies of neurodevelopmental conditions tend to come from very high socioeconomic status backgrounds, often like middle-class families. And that's because to take part in one of these longitudinal cohort studies, you need to be motivated and interested in research. And yeah, so this particular study I'm going to tell you about, they're assessed 5 times before the age of 3. So that's actually a quite intensive study. And this, I think, is usually not done in this kind of research, usually because we have quite small samples. But when we have, hundreds of participants and we get a nice data set like the one I'm talking to you about, then it's quite interesting to see how this might be influencing the development of early cognitive skills as well. So onto the methods. I just need to take a second water. Okay. So the data for this study came from 3 phases of the British Autism study of infant siblings. And this is one of these infant sibling longitudinal cohort studies. So the 3 phases just means that they were studied, sorry, that they were born at different points in time. So it's 3 phases of collection. So the ones in phase 3 were born like several years after the ones in phase 2 and the ones in phase 1. So the total number of infants that had data from those phases was 381. But for the purposes of this study, I excluded half siblings because they're less genetically related to their sibling than full siblings. I also excluded infants who had elevated likelihood for autism as well as ADHD. The 3rd phase of the British Autism study was designed to also capture information about ADHD, but we know that individuals with autism and ADHD tend to show a bit of a different profile in terms of cognitive skills to those with just autism or just ADHD. And because there's only 37 of them, I didn't really have enough information to kind of analyze them separately in my models, so I excluded those infants. And finally, I excluded 1 infant who wasn't kind of following the general pattern of the data across the different measures, so they were a multivariate outlier. So this gave me a total sample of 339 infants, and 239 of them had an autistic older sibling, so elevated likelihood. Importantly, there was an equal sex distribution in the elevated and typical likelihood groups, with slightly more boys in both. And the time period that this data comes from is between 2006 and 2018. Okay, so how did the sample look in terms of demographics? Well, if you look down the whole sample column, you can see that on average, these are kind of skewed towards high family education levels, so maternal highest level of education. And actually, in particular, the typical familial likelihood group have highly educated mothers. Household income, though, is a slightly different story. So the spread is pretty good across the different income categories. Looks quite a good spread in the elevated likelihood group, but we see the typical likelihood group, as I kind of alluded to in the introduction, actually coming from very affluent families. Okay, and then our cognitive measures. The sensory motor skills of the participating infants were assessed using the Mullen scales of early learning. So this is a standardized behavioural assessment suitable from 0 to 68-month-old infants. And the key measure that we got from this tool was the sensory motor composite score. So this involves visual reception. So these are tasks like pattern matching, visual fixation, so like looking at an object and following it, which is tracking, as well as like visual recognition memory. And it also incorporates fine motor measures. So this is things like dexterity and manipulation of objects. And the demands of this task change with age, but we use the same measure throughout. So we use whichever kind of questions or tasks are appropriate for that particular age group. This measure also can give us information about expressive and receptive language. And I just note that because it becomes relevant later on where I replicate some of the models looking at these things. And then effortful control was measured using Rothbart's temperament questionnaires. So this is the infant behaviour questionnaire, early childhood behaviour questionnaire, and the child behaviour questionnaire. So again, slightly different questions to make them developmentally appropriate, depending on the age of the child. So this was parental report, and they were asked to rate the frequency of certain behaviours over the past 7 days. And this effortful control subscale measures things like soothability and how easy the child finds it to shift their attention and focus on tasks. And you get an average score across the items, which is the measure that we use here. There's also other aspects of temperament measured by this questionnaire, but they weren't really of interest to this study. And finally, autism characteristics was measured using the social responsiveness scale. This is a parental report measure again. and it assesses the presence of and degree to which autism characteristics are apparent in everyday life. So you get a total score, which is then converted to a standard score based on the gender of the child and their age. And in this study, we treat the standard score as continuous, which makes this study a little bit different to lots. So we're not saying diagnosis of autism or above clinical cutoff for autism, yes or no. We're saying like, we're treating autism as a continuous measure. Okay, so just to kind of repeat this, we have 5 measures across the first 3 years of life of effortful control and sensory motor skills. So the Mullen scales, it's the same throughout, but with the exact tasks that we use changing a little bit. But for the effortful control skills, we switched to slightly different versions of these questionnaires for age appropriateness. And these are known to be highly correlated, the scores across these, and I did also check in this data set that they are highly correlated. And then at 36 months, we have our outcome measure for some of my models, which is the social responsiveness scale, our measure of autism characteristics.
So when you say they're highly correlated, do you mean across the time?
Yeah, so within one child, their
Yeah.
score at one time point correlates with the score at another.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you, Asher, for clarifying. Okay, and then the analysis. Oh, I should also say that at most time points, I think with slight differences early on, you see significant differences on these scales between the infants with typical likelihood for autism and the infants with elevated likelihood, whereby the infants with typical likelihood are scoring significantly higher on these measures. Okay, so to analyze this data, for the first part, I used random intercept cross-lab panel modeling. It sounds scary, but it's basically fancy regression models. And yes, I use this to look at associations between effortful control and sensory motor skills. So the kind of developmental relationships between those skills across the 5 time points that I was talking about. So basically what this technique does is it allows you to separate out within person development, so how that child's effortful control skills are developing over time, from like stable differences between infants. So even though, you know, skills are developing, if you ranked the infants in order of how good they were on this particular measure, that tends to stay fairly I'm struggling to get this word out. Stay fairly stable across development. And yeah, so basically some other techniques that don't do this, they kind of confuse that like between person differences with within person development. So it's just separating those out essentially. And then in terms of understanding how effortful control skills and sensory motor skills relate to autism characteristics, we use multiple regression models with interaction terms to see whether these things are interacting to predict autism characteristics, as Amend would suggest, and also whether these skills interact with familial likelihood for autism. In all the models, I use this technique called full information maximum likelihood estimation. This basically allows you to make use of all the data available. So there's a small amount of missing data in this cohort, which might just be, for example, that the parent didn't fill in the question about what their education level is, things like this. And it means we don't have to exclude those infants based on a small amount of missing information, which could affect our ability to detect significant results, essentially. And this is a bit complicated. But
sounds complicated.
I don't know why I left this in. So in phase 1, I kind of lied a little bit about the design for that. So this is how it looks for phases 2 and 3. But phase 1, there was only one assessment point between 4 and 10 months. So what I did there was I took, so the infants who were 8 to 10 in that group, that became their scores for infant behaviour questionnaire Mullen scales at 8 to 10. And then I used all the rest of the data we had about them to impute. So like it's an estimate of their score at 4 to 7 months. And then I did the same for the younger infants. They get an imputed score at 8 to 10 months. Again, this is just to maximize the data we have. These are kind of complicated models. But I rerun the models without the imputation to check, and the results don't really change.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. And then I also, as I suggested earlier on, I reran these models, replacing language skills, so receptive and expressive language, with the sensory motor skills, because kind of a key aspect of those theories I was talking about, developmental cascades and amend, they're really talking about the relationships between early developing low-level skills and more complex skills. And language is not such a potentially like simple, complex cognitive skill as sensory motor skills. So as a kind of test of those theories, I wanted to see whether you get similar results when you swap that out. So let's dive into the results. Okay, so first model. So this is the model showing like within person development and between person like difference. So what we can see here, when we've got a filled in line, that's a significant relationship. And when it's dotted, it's not statistically significant. And the interesting parts here are that like there is a significant relationship between infant differences in effortful control and sensory motor skills. So your kind of relative position on those two scales. And also from 12 to 15 months onward, we see that sensory motor skills predict later effortful control skills. So this is what it means by cross-lagged. You like use the score at one time point to predict the score of the next. But we don't see that the opposite is true. So we don't see significant relationships from effortful control skills to sensory motor skills at any of the time points. And you see that effortful control is quite stable across time, but there's kind of less stability in sensory motor skills as well. So those are kind of the key things to pull out from that one. And when I reran these models, swapping out this bottom line sensory motor composite for language skills, we found a similar pattern, but actually language was predicting effortful control from earlier in development. So we also got a significant relationship between 8 to 10 month sensory motor skills and 12 to 15 month effortful control. But again, no evidence of bidirectionality. Okay, second result, so very similar model, but now we're just controlling for socioeconomic status, and we're looking at whether that's explaining any stable between child differences in these skills. And looking at effortful control and sensory motor skills, we didn't find evidence that socioeconomic status, the indicators we had of it, was linked to individual differences in effortful control and sensory motor skills. But what we did find when we swapped out sensory motor skills for language is that household income, but not maternal education level, predicted individual differences in the sensory motor, in the Mullins language scores. So take those with a pinch of salt, because of course I've run a lot of models, and swapping this out, there's some kind of more exploratory work, but this is kind of consistent with what we know from other studies about language skills being particularly sensitive to socioeconomic factors. Okay, third results, now onto some more simple models. So just to be clear here, for each time point, I would have like 4 to 7 month effortful control and sensory motor skills predicting 36-month autism characteristics. So these are separate models each time. And I don't do 36 months, predicting 36 months, because I'm not interested in cross-sectional results. What we see is that from 8 to 10 months onward, effortful control skills predict autism characteristics. And you can see from this graph, which shows basically standardized effect sizes, that the strength of the relationship between effortful control skills and autism characteristics increases with age. You see this trend here. We also see a significant association of sensory motor skills with 36-month autism characteristics from 12 to 15 months, but we don't really see this kind of same notable pattern in terms of age increases, maybe slight, but yeah, it doesn't seem to be so apparent. And then carrying on from there, so rerunning those regression models, adding an interaction to see whether there might be evidence that effortful control skills do modulate that relationship between sensory motor skills and autism characteristics. We only found evidence for an interaction at 24 months. So this could be interpreted that there is like this modulatory effect of effortful control and sensory motor skills, but bear in mind that, yeah, the interaction wasn't significant in other models. But what that showed us was that the relationship between sensory motor skills and autism characteristics was higher at lower levels of effortful control. So when you have very strong effortful control skills, there's not much difference between infants in terms of how good they are on the sensory motor composite. But when effortful control skills are low, there's a much more notable difference in terms of their level of autism characteristics, depending on their level of sensory motor skills. Although there was only an interaction that was significant at 24 months, all of these models fit the data better. So they were kind of providing a better account of what we were seeing than the model that only looked at like independent effects of effortful control skills and sensory motor skills on autism characteristics. But this wasn't true when we replaced sensory motor skills with language skills. So there wasn't evidence consistent with amend when we looked at language skills, which is what we'd expect because language doesn't really fit the bill for those kind of early, more simple cognitive skills. And then finally, last page of results. We found that effortful control was a much stronger predictor of autism characteristics in infants who had elevated likelihood for autism. This was an effect that was present at 12 to 15 and at 24 months. So you can see this here in the graphs. The white lines are the infants who don't have an autistic older sibling. They're pretty much flat. It doesn't matter what their level of effortful control skills are. They have very low levels of autism characteristics. But in the elevated likelihood group, when effortful control skills are very high, the relationship with autism characteristics. When effortful control skills are high, there's very low levels of autism characteristics. But when the effortful control skills are lower, then autism characteristics are much higher. We didn't find an interaction like this between familial likelihood and sensory motor skills. So it suggests that effortful control is something that's really important in terms of predicting a child's future levels of autism characteristics, especially in infants with elevated likelihood for autism. But we didn't find a significant three-way interaction. So this is kind of trying to test that idea put forward by Amend, that these kind of modulatory effects are going to be more important in infants who have elevated likelihood for autism. But we'll go on and talk about that in the discussion about why that might not be. Okay, so how can we summarize all these results and what are the strengths and limitations?
You're doing good.
Cool. So first of all, we see that both sensory motor skills and language skills predict later effortful control across infancy. And these effects are starting to emerge from around the first year of life. We didn't find any evidence for bidirectionality in this study, which is kind of what developmental cascades would have predicted, but maybe that comes into play later in development when our effortful control skills are a bit more mature, and then therefore maybe influencing the development of other skills more. We found evidence of additive effects, so independent effects of sensory motor skills and effortful control skills on later autism characteristics. And the fact that we saw this trend of increasing associations between effortful control skills and autism characteristics is suggestive of the cumulative effects that developmental cascades predicts. We also found some evidence that effortful control might modulate the relationship between sensory motor difficulties and autism characteristics, but as I say, this was only present at one time point. But our results show that effortful control meets the criteria for anterior modifiers. So we've got evidence for an interaction. We've got increasing strength of association between that skill and autism characteristics with age. And what was the other one? Just me, it makes. I can't see my notes on my slide. But we didn't find evidence that the interaction effects were stronger in infants with elevated likelihood for autism. And maybe this is due to measurement or modelling issues. So it may be that because the infants with elevated likelihood for autism, they do have more difficulties with sensory motor skills and effortful control skills, but they also have other co-occurring difficulties. Maybe this is just such a strong predictor that we can't see those other things. And then the other kind of issue that we had in this study is that our effortful control measure and our sensory motor skills measure are kind of picking up on slightly overlapping skills. So for example, to sit down and repeat the tapping pattern that some restrained adult has shown you, you do need quite a good level of effortful control skills. So there's not like a complete distinction between them. So it could have been kind of a purer test of these theories. And what did we see in terms of socioeconomic status? Well, we found that household income predicted between infant differences in language skills, but we didn't find that there was a relationship between effortful control skills or sensory motor skills and household income or maternal education. Nevertheless, I think this demonstrates the importance of studying socio-demographic factors in the context of neurodiversity. And our results are kind of consistent with previous studies in typically developing children, suggesting that there are separable, like distinguishable effects of income and education on child outcomes, and also that there seems to be that some cognitive skills are more sensitive to socioeconomic status than others, so particularly language skills, as I mentioned. And the strengths and implications of this study. I think this study makes a contribution to our understanding of individual differences in the outcomes of infants who have elevated likelihood for autism. It shows the importance of considering interactions between skills and development. So, often just measuring one skill is not going to be enough in terms of getting good prediction. And it provides one of the first formal tests of this amend theory, which was put forward by some of my co-authors on this paper. And the findings, in addition to further research, could be used to inform early screening programs, which could mitigate against some of those negative consequences of late identification that I talked about earlier. Limitations. We had multiple self-report measures in this study, and they might be affected by the same factors affecting accuracy. So in particular, for example, the mothers of autistic children, so the elevated likelihood infants who have an autistic older sibling, those mothers may be more sensitive to autism characteristics in the infant sibling, that they know what to look for. They've got this experience already of parenting an autistic child. So maybe their reports are more accurate than the typical familial likelihood infants. We can also question the ecological validity of the Mullins scales. That was our sensory motor and language measure. So yes, we measure it 5 times over development, but it is really like a one-shot attempt to show me how good you are at, I don't know, sensory motor skills. Whereas the effortful control scale, maybe it was a better predictor because it's like asking what the child is actually like in daily life, giving a kind of more complete view of those skills. We also just looked at one possible modified skill relationship. So as I was saying, the development of the early development in kind of neurodivergent children is complex. It's way more than just effortful control, sensory motor skills, and language. There's so much else. Amend theory kind of proposes multiple different modifiers, and this is just one of them. So, for example, social engagement, how the children are looking at faces, for example, in social situations during very early development has also been suggested to be one important possible anterior modifier. So, this is just one piece of a very big and complex picture, essentially. So that's the end of my presentation, and thank you to my co-authors. And I hope that was all clear to everyone, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Roisin. Oh my goodness. So, well, I've got about 1,000 questions, but I think I will, because there's a few in the chat, so I will. Yes. I'll give way to the chat, and we will go from there. So, Catherine says, "Hi, thank you so much. It's very interesting that you've adopted the infant sibling design," and she was wondering, how were the children with autism initially diagnosed? So, was there genetic testing, or was it through behavioural assessment?
That's a really good question. I think the children initially diagnosed, the older siblings, think it's through assessment. I'm actually not certain on this. And yeah, this is secondary data, so I don't know all of the ins and outs necessarily, but I would imagine it was through assessment. And I think this relates to another question in the chat about what percentage of participants. So by 3 years of age, 18% of the elevated likelihood group have autism diagnoses. So bear in mind, this is early still, and some may receive them later on. Well, we wouldn't expect all of them to, but none of the typical familial likelihood infants had an autism diagnosis at 3 years, or were kind of like past the clinical level of autism characteristics based on the measure we were using.
Thank you. I think I might ask Catherine's next question next. I think you said you didn't really look at the ADHD characteristics, but she asks, did you see any crossover with these ADHD characteristics at 24 months?
Yeah, so there were in basis there are infants who have elevated likelihood for ADHD as well. I didn't look at them in this study because there weren't really enough infants to kind of treat them as a separate group, and I didn't want to like add extra kind of noise into the data basically where they might be a bit more variable compared to the other infants. But I think it's a really interesting question, and I think there probably is overlap. Yeah, I think so. Sorry, that's probably not very satisfying answer. It's not something I looked at.
Yeah. So Mahi asks, were there any differences for expressive versus receptive language skills?
Oh, great question, Mahi. Again, I didn't look at it. I was just looking at the composite score.
Yeah.
But possibly you would expect this. Yeah. Yeah.
Because at the beginning you said how it sort of became relevant to the findings later on, but
so
I remember how it linked in.
Yeah, so the expressive and receptive language skills, they go together to make this language composite.
Oh,
which is what I was using later when I was basically seeing how the models turned out when I replaced sensory motor skills for language skills, but I didn't look at differences. You didn't look at it, sort of break it down. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. No, absolutely. I'll come back to Gary's again because it links to a question that I had, which, as you know, was quite practical, thinking about interventions and stuff. But Helen says it's really interesting and excellent work, Roisin. I forgot to applaud you for just what a mammoth project that is and how well you've done with all the models and everything. Thank you.
She says she'd love to chat with you about some of the infant sibling research at City. That's nice.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great.
Maybe you'd like to put your email in the chat or something.
Yes.
So Helen says, have you got, I've lost it. Have you got follow-up data for any of the basis children beyond age 3?
It does go beyond age 3, yes. They're not studied as regularly after age 3. As you can see, it was already, the gaps were increasing between the assessment points. But yes, there are cognitive assessments later. And actually something I hope to do, and I still hope can happen, is to eventually link that cognitive data with school outcomes. Because I think that'd be really interesting. And it's not really been done too much in the context of autism. So yeah, but I've only focused on the very early data so far.
Helen, do you want to say something? I can see you've come on camera. Do you want to say something?
I don't want to take over Roisin's talk, but I just wanted to say hi, Roisin, and I put my email in the chat. It would be, I think you know some of my colleagues, but it would be really interesting if we could chat. Just that we found some interesting results following children up to age 7, like with a real focus on communication rather than kind of broader psychological measures that we've just submitted some work for publication showing that a lot of our children change likelihood classification because where their elder siblings were thought to be typically developing when the children were babies, by the time that they're 7, some of their elder siblings have got autism diagnoses.
Really interesting.
And we also have a group with increased likelihood of language disorder, as well as a group with increased likelihood of autism. And I just would really like to chat with you about it when you've got time.
Yeah, no, that would be great. I will note your email down and definitely.
I won't take up any more of your time though.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I have wondered a bit about the stability of all of this.
Yeah.
And development. So, and actually it's just increasingly so that people get diagnosed later in life. And thank you.
No, thank you, Helen. That's a really, really useful contribution. And yay, we've made some connections. That's really good. So Gary, I have not forgotten your question. I will be coming back to it. But I just wanted to start on my kind of unpicking my train of thought a little bit here. And particularly with, because all this stuff about reciprocal influence and the cascade theories and all this, and everything knocking into everything else, it makes it really difficult to unpick what is causing what and everything, I just, kind of wanted to ask about this method specifically, and kind of maybe the strengths and limitations of it in terms of like looking at these complex relationships. Do you think it's the best method we've got? Are there any other kind of ways of looking at it out there? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It is hard to study this, and you know, these recent developmental theories that are just all about complexity, it does give us a very challenging job. I think the like statistical technique I used was very useful. I think the data, like if it was designed for the specific purposes of the study, it could have been, you know, it could have been more precise measures of the skills I was trying to get at. We talk a bit in the paper about how potentially like more kind of neurocognitive measures of attention might have been more informative than the parent report. So it's difficult to study these things because partly you need a big data set, lots of measures, repeated measures over development, and the kind of the more detailed and precise you go, the less you can do. So it's kind of a challenge there. I think, have I answered your question?
You have, yeah, and it knocks into another question I've got on here, which was about sample size. So, I mean, and I was thinking about the SES things. You didn't find SES was a significant predictor at one point. I just wondered, again, because this is such a complicated method, and I know I've looked at how to do power analysis for like mixed models before and everything. So do you have an indication of like, was the sample size big enough, or?
I mean, possibly not to detect some of those smaller relationships. I think, when you're in this kind of level of complexity with this kind of sample, you can't too much worry about the significance. But I, of course, like I am using that as a guide because I'm doing a lot of analysis as well. I think, you know, small associations are still important sometimes, and maybe a bigger sample I would have picked up on it. Something I would say on the socioeconomic status measures, we did see, so this is maybe like something that was wrong in terms of how I was conceptualizing those relationships, just from like correlations between the socioeconomic status indicators and the cognitive outcomes, that those were like becoming stronger with age. So maybe these aren't stable between infant differences that relate to them, but maybe at a particular point in early development, those are very important. And that's in the way I modeled them, not something that I could pick up on.
Really interesting. And actually that kind of links into what Gary and I were sort of just about to ask about interventions, because it can be really, really hard to develop sensory motor skills. You know, a lot of autistic children tend to have quite severe impairments, so it can be hard to kind of overcome that, you know. And obviously, like in this study, you're not testing, does improving sensory motor skills, you know, so you can't really tell.
It's observational.
It's observational, but at the same time, in your knowledge, you know, is there any kind of work on that, or anything that shows that improving some of these early skills can improve the cognitive side of things?
Improve the cognitive side. That's a good question. I do know actually Tuche, who just completed her PhD in the IOE, she was doing some work about like motor skills and some intervention work, but it was in school-aged autistic children. I don't know if she looked at a transfer to cognitive skills, but I mean, I don't know the intervention literature well, I must say. But what you can kind of see here is that there are these points in development. They are obviously, they're getting closer to the point you measure autism characteristics, so maybe just more reliable in that sense. But by 24 months, these things do appear to be having like, well, they're at least related to other cognitive skills, potentially means they're impacting on them. So suggests, you know, if you intervene earlier in development, then you might get knock-on effects. But we do know just in general in psychology that this kind of transfer from training one thing to another doesn't always work as well as we'd expect. So I think it's not exactly easy to go from this kind of research to that kind of research. So I'm sorry, that's an answer.
No, it's not. It's the honest answer. And you know, again, like Gary, you know, I'm sorry if that doesn't 100% answer your question, but it's essentially making the leap from this looking at relationships to actually saying, well, you should be working on sensory motor, early sensory motor skills. I mean, you know, I can hear Michael in my ear saying, you know, he's Michael's here. Probably say something like, it probably doesn't hurt to work on early sensory motor skills if you
exactly.
can. You know?
Yeah. And we see that, you know, even if, so these things were like separately related to autism characteristics, but also jointly at 24 months. So, you know, even if you don't get like, oh, these wonderful other cognitive benefits of like supporting children to develop those sensory motor skills, you know, you've at least, like you say, you've improved their sensory motor skills. But in terms of whether that would then result in lower levels of autism characteristics, I think that's actually difficult to say.
That is difficult to establish.
I think because this could just be like some kind of like unfolding of, you know, what are the early markers of something that we then can diagnose as autism. Yeah.
I mean, Lindis asked a very similar question about, you know, if you work on early ethical control, would it make a difference? And I guess that answer applies here as well. You know, it doesn't hurt to work on it, but based on this work, we can't definitively say it would.
And I agree with what Gary's saying here. It is really important to understand how we can embed this to develop practice. I think this isn't the type of research that's that well suited to kind of translation, but it's the first part of a research story that will then, like, you know, from these kind of big observational studies, you can then go in and try some intervention work, see if that kind of is supporting the kind of the causal relationships you think that your results are showing. But it's definitely a challenge.
That actually locks in perfectly to, I guess, my sort of final-ish question, this stuff about a research story, right? But before I say that, Emily says, thank you very much for this presentation. I'm not well versed in advanced research and I found this very easy to follow and understand. So that's lovely.
I'm so pleased.
Thank you, Emily. But so this thing about a research story and this sort of being one of the first steps, what do you think is kind of the most important finding to sort of take forward in that journey?
Wow.
That's
a big question.
Well, it doesn't have to be one, it could be two or three, but what do you think are sort of the headlines here?
I think something I didn't actually mention really in the presentation, the fact that we I think the fact that we treated autism characteristics as a continuous thing, so we're not looking at like, does the child have autism, yes or no? That I think is what allowed us to pick up on these very early relationships. Like it's very unusual to find, you know, prediction from some measure but before the first year of life. So I think that kind of is an important like methodological point. But I think also, I mean, we called the paper 24-month effortful control. That was the thing. Every way we looked at it, there was something very important going on in 24 months. And I guess this is kind of the age where we can start to more reliably diagnose autism. But I think there's a lot of findings, so maybe there's something else that I guess it also just like it speaks to like the complexity and that, you know, development is not just one cognitive skill. We have to kind of consider these things together if we're going to understand how we eventually get to some outcome that we describe as a neurodevelopmental condition.
That's lovely. I mean, it that 24 months, because it sort of is at the end of that first 1,000 days period, as they say as well. So that seems to be quite an important. Absolutely.
I mean, I must say I'm usually an adolescent researcher. The early years stuff, like the importance of the first few years, I sometimes say, oh, remember teenagers. But yes, I must say these data really strongly show that does seem to be an important time.
Absolutely. And linking back to what you said at the start about, you know, getting in early, you know, some people possibly don't realize how important it is for those knock-on effects, because these knock-on effects can still be happening in the teenage years, can't they?
Absolutely. And that's what I think would be really interesting to look at. Like, do these early kind of cognitive differences, is that predicting like later educational outcomes? And hopefully one day manage to do that piece of work.
Hopefully you can. Maybe you'll work with Helen and do some of it.
Oh, that would be great. Yes, definitely going to email Helen.
Lovely. Well, if there's no more questions,
I think Irene had a question.
Oh,
I'm not sure
she have a question?
She had her hand up, but I think she's gone.
Oh, is she gone?
I don't know.
Oh, I didn't see her. Oh, hang on. Oh no, that's scary. No, I think we're all good. So unless there are any sort of very last second questions, I know Michael, sometimes you like to slip one in, slip one in right at the end. But other than that, we will we will conclude. And thank you so much, Roisin, for coming. And yeah, no questions for Michael. There we go. But you're here in spirit. You're here on my shoulder.
Well, he knows this paper very well. He's an author.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everybody. So that is our final CEN seminar of the Christmas term. So we'll be back in January, and stay tuned. We've got some fantastic talks coming up next term as well. And hope you all have a wonderful Christmas. Yeah, Merry Christmas, everybody, and Happy New Year. See you in 2025.
Merry Christmas, everyone. Enjoy
Bye,
your break.
Helen. Nice to see you. Stop recording.